Hello, in this video we're going to go through 222, but I'm going to focus on part 2, which we still have a is equal to 1 for the quadratic, but it's going to be more not in standard form. So these are special cases. And I'm not so much going to focus on actually solving the problems, because if you want to see how to do that, you can go to part 1. But I'm going to more focus on like how to fix a problem that could be happening. And there's 3 specific things I want to look at. First one is if the quadratic is out of order or it's on both sides. So what we're going to do is we are going to move or reorder. So we have our quadratic, which is ax squared plus bx plus c, all on the same side. There's one thing that's super important, and that is that a cannot be negative. So if when you're moving things, a becomes negative, you will have to divide everything by -1 to be able to fix it. So let's quickly look at an example. And again, I'm not going to solve this entire quadratic, but I am going to fix it, and then you can use your part 1 knowledge to be able to actually solve it. So I noticed that in our quadratic here, we have our x squared term, our x, and then our constant, but they're not all on the same side. So we need to move something or some things to all be on the same side. And what I want to look at is our x squared term, so this r squared. If this was negative, we would want to move that because we want it to be positive. But since it's already positive, I want to keep r squared where it is because it's positive, and I don't want to mess that up. So that means anything that's on the other side I want to move. So I want to move this -1. I'm just going to rewrite this. And to move -1, I just add 1 to both sides. I don't have any like terms, so I just end up with my quadratic is equal to 0. And then you could go ahead and do your t-chart of things that multiply to 1 and add to -2, just like in part 1. But we have now fixed it. Let's look at the second situation. The second one is if we're missing a value. And there's 2 choices for what we could be missing. So if we are missing C, so if we're missing our C value, we went over one of these in part 1, and that's one way that you could do it, where you just know that C is equal to 0 and you solve the same way. Or you can factor out x from both terms. So let's look at an example of what that would look like. Okay, so this down here, I have 2 examples, and we're going to look at the second one where C is missing. So I have my A and I have my B, but C is missing. So you could either do the t-chart and make C equal 0, or you can see that I have 2 x's here and 1 x here. So I could factor out one of them by pulling an x out. So I can change this to x. This is the x that I'm going to pull out. If I pull out an x from here, there's just 1 left. And if I pull out an x for here, there's none left. So I'm left with x and x plus 10. And then these are my factors. So I've essentially done the same thing, but without the work of making the t-chart. All I had to do was pull out the x in front, and then I can split and solve. So I have x equals 0 and x plus 10 equals 0, which gives me my answers. Okay, let's go back up to what happens if B is missing. So this is what happens when C is missing. If B is missing, let's underline that. We do what's called the square root method. And basically what that is we are going to have our constant on one side, x squared on the other, and we're going to solve in square root. Seems a little weird, like these directions. However, once you see the example, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So just make sure you have this written down, pause it if you need to, and let's look at this example. So in this case, we have our A and we have our C, but we're missing B. So when you're missing your B value, you can simply change this to 0. So we're going to set this equal to 0. And then we want our constant on one side and our variable on the other. So it doesn't really matter which one I move. Since this one is a minus sign, I'm just going to add this to both sides so that I get it to be a plus. Then if there is a number in front of x squared, we want to divide both sides by that number. And then here is the part where we can actually solve it. So instead of doing like the t-chart and everything like that, if we have our b value is missing, we can simply get to this part and then square root both sides. When you type in the square root of 225, you get an answer of 15. But you are smarter than your calculator, and we know that we are always going to have two answers, and it is going to be both positive 15 and negative 15. So my two solutions are positive 15 and negative 15. And you can write it like this, or you can write them separately, whatever makes sense to you. But here are the special cases when either B is missing or C is missing. You could also do the t-chart for this one and just know that B is 0, but I highly recommend learning these two methods because they take significantly less time than if you were to make your t-chart. Moving on to the very last special case that we're going to talk about today, and that is if we have a number in front of x squared. We're going to do something similar to when we were missing C, and we are going to factor out a GCF. Remember, a GCF is the greatest common factor, the largest number we can divide all terms by. So looking at this example, we can see that our A value is not 1. So when that happens, you need to check for a GCF. So in this case, our GCF is typically the number that's in front of like our A value. Our GCF is almost always our A value. So in this case, our A value is -1. I just want to make sure I can divide everything by -1. Everything can be divided by -1, so I don't really have to check. But if it was a number that's like 2, well, 8 can be divided by 2, but 15 can't. We get a decimal. So that would not be our GCF, so we would have to try other numbers. So since we know our GCF is 1, or -1, sorry, we are going to divide everything by -1. Divide by -1, divide by -1, divide by -1. So I get x squared plus 8x plus 15. Now a equals 1, so we are happy, so we can start our process. So if your a value is not 1, you just have to do some extra little math to get it to be a is 1, and then you can do the same process of factoring. So these are 3 special cases, and although they're special, that does not mean they're uncommon. These happen a lot, so you need to know how to do all 3 of these things. Reorder your quadratic, factor when you're missing C or B, and then factor out a greatest common factor.